today on leading issues in historical studies of schooling. And I will introduce both our panelists after I say a little bit about what I've asked them to speak about. I've asked them both to talk, first of all, about something about their own research on schooling in mass societies in particular cases, but also to speak in a way that gives us a sense of why the study of schooling is particularly important for understanding mass societies in a historical way, and also to help us think about ways in which those kinds of historical studies of schooling in mass societies can speak to contemporary debates, can inform contemporary debates about education policy, but also about pedagogy. So, how in doing historical studies, we're going to address broader historical questions, but also how that history can be a usable history for us in terms of our concerns about education today. And our two panelists are Professor Nita Kumar. Her many books include Lessons from Schools, A History of Education in Benares, and is that the one the bookstore has outside? So in both cases, books by our panelists are available thanks to Huntley outside. She's also the author of The Politics of Gender, Community, and Modernity, Essays on Education, and she holds the Brown Family Chair of South Asian History at Claremont McKenna College. And then our second panelist is Diana Selig, and she's the author of Americans All, The Cultural Gifts Movement, which is a really interesting study of efforts at multicultural education earlier than our own moment, earlier in the 20th century by several decades. And I think it is a good example of a kind of history that gives us a perspective on efforts at multicultural education in our present moment. And she's also written numerous articles on the history of social science, the history of child and race in the United States. And she's an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. And it's a great pleasure to welcome them and to thank them for walking across the street, which can be a big thing. And we're going to start with Nita Kumar, and it's really a pleasure to welcome her here. Sure, she's going to go to the podium.
I have lots and lots of themes and topics that I'd love to crowd into my talk. But just as the scope of the picture is limited, so is my time limited. And I'm going to be very disciplined, which is in the nature of education in any case, and talk about hopefully 4 things which will fit into my time. And I'm going to try to make, in each case, the larger point about history writing and what I see as the most important debates or controversies in Indian history writing and how those may be illuminated by using the lens of education. Usually, I begin a talk on education by talking about the most important problem of Indian education, which is that at the present moment, after about 60 years of struggle, India still has 40% illiteracy, which is a huge number in terms of millions of people when you have a population of over 1 billion. And there is a very large number of dropouts, and that increases phenomenally from elementary up to high school. That's one problem. And the other problem that I see is that regardless of the level of literacy and so on, the quality of Indian education is very poor across the board for all kinds of schools. India has numerous kinds of schools, depending on the language which is used as the medium of instruction, whether they are private or public, and there's all kinds of rules about minorities being able to run their own institutions, so there are madrasas and missionary schools of all kinds, and so on. And my claim is, my research finding is that there is a very low quality, a poverty, as I call it, in the educational level of India. So those are the 2 most important problems. But when I talk about Indian education, I try to use my historical research and my anthropological research to explain or try to discuss why these problems exist. Today what I want to do is a little bit of the opposite. I want to talk about how we might better understand some important questions in history and how to do history at all by looking at certain problems in education. So instead of using history for education, use education for history. and hopefully thereby help us all to make some generalizations across the board, which you might be able to use in your own work, etc. So one of the most important positions taken in contemporary history writing of other histories, that is not Western histories, but those of the colonies and the post-colonies, is exemplified by a historian called Dipesh Chakravarti, whose book called Provincializing Europe makes the rhetorical and quite often eloquent claim that the histories of other people, apart from that of Europe and the West, have been marginalized, and that those histories have lost their position in history, in representation, and that those voices are lost, and we don't know, those histories have ceased to exist. We don't know what histories there are that belong to local people and ordinary people, and so on. Now, my research on education and other such positions, research on education, I think shows just the opposite. So I find myself at odds with this important claim that you have to, as the title of his book indicates, provincialize Europe. You have to reverse this action that has taken place through colonialism mostly and Orientalism. You know, think Edward Said and think all the work on colonialism, which has provincialized the colony. So you have to reverse it. And according to me, if you look at if you expand your understanding of the term education and you look at different sites of education, you find that there are lots of different worlds that continue to exist in a country like India, and there are several countries like India. And there are several pockets in the West which are exactly like India. So you will find extant all kinds of worlds, as I call them, epistemologies, value systems, genres, narratives, identities of the self, and so on, that are extant, that are alive and well, that have their own histories, their own positionings, and education is a very important and very useful lens for looking into them. So I'm interested, for instance, in the way that artisans reproduce themselves. And here I have apprenticeship. These are some of the artisans I look at: wooden toy making and weaving. This is a dyer, a weaver. I'm very interested in the way music and dance is taught in completely alternative systems of teaching and learning. And here you have two very interesting products of this alternative system of education. Particularly looking at the weavers, you find that they, this is in North India, they are Muslim weavers. All their children either get no formal schooling at all, or they go to madrasas for their education. Looking at their madrasas and interviewing the children, studying them, you see that there are certain things they don't have. They do not have the so-called factual knowledge which belongs to normative schooled children. They do not know the history of the nation. They don't know what's called the foundational history, the normative mainstream history. They can't tell you important facts in their history. They can't even tell you actually who was, you know, if you ask them name one great leader in the country or name one important event, they can't answer questions like that because their education is really bad by normative standards. At the same time, what they do have is a very rich knowledge of their own community, its past and its present, its ethics, its norms. They have very well-honed skills in their own craft from about the age of 8 or 10 onwards. And it's very difficult to make a case that they are not quote-unquote educated. So looking at the weavers, I have in my research made in several articles, the argument that if you contrast them with middle class or normative kind of schooling, and then, you know, I have interviewed and studied middle class children, then you find a very interesting seesaw position. The weavers don't have a guarantee of success in life. They do not have social mobility. They do not have that kind of freedom to be whatever they like, which the middle class successfully aspires to. And the middle class have all that. But what the weavers do have is a total continuity with their past, a very rich store of narratives and symbols in their 5 very rich performance genres, and they have a kind of guarantee or stability of what they will be. Their identity is very holistically constructed, and they have freedom. Now this, I've mentioned one scholar. I'm going to pepper my talk with just mention of 4 or 5 scholars. The next one I want to mention is Amartya Sen, the Nobel Prize winner, whose book itself is called Development is Freedom, and development is his shorthand for education. So education is development, and therefore education and development is freedom. And I'm not the only person doing education research to challenge him on that, but it's difficult to agree with him on both scores, on the development part and the freedom part. Regarding freedom, for instance, what the argument I'm making is that you don't have to go to school to become a free person. These weavers, children who don't go to school, are extremely free. They enjoy more freedom than the middle class disciplined child does. But why I call it a seesaw relationship is because they have freedom in the short run. Their freedom is involuntary. It's not that they have a choice to be a weaver's child. When they grow up, they'll still be a weaver. So they are already being reproduced by forces beyond them, by the community, by other kinds of constructs, which are partly the states, partly the community, partly the labor process itself. So freedom in the short run for them, and for middle class children, freedom in the long run, if that's what you want to call it, the freedom to choose your career and to be socially mobile. So I do have to say then that to do justice in history writing to other kinds of education, you have to pit it against the state-run, normative, mainstream, modern, if you like, educational system in most countries, including in India, because these other local, indigenous and alternative systems are very powerful, they're very rich, they are complex, they are definitely everything that an education system should be, but structurally, they do not give power to those that they educate. Those people are relatively powerless compared to the others who have mainstream schooling. My second kind of interest in education has been, and I have sort of used this term, I've made it my own and propagated it a lot, I've called it provincialism. My interest is in provincialism, how certain parts of the same country, which is another reason why I differ from scholars who want to conceive of the world as divided up into countries or nation states and histories based on that. I think it's within one society, within a country or a nation state that you have the most important and threatening kinds of divisions. So provincialism is the name for the one that I find most interesting in India, and what it arises from is, again, colonial processes when the older centers of civilization and margin, the center and margin was reversed, and the colonial state made new relationships between truth and knowledge and power, thus reversing the accepted ones. So you have, as a result, to cut a long story short, the production of certain parts of the country, and they are the majority of the parts, so almost all of India. There are very few metropolises. Most of it is small towns and villages. And it's all those small towns and villages that have been successfully provincialized by the introduction of modern colonial education into India. What provincialism means is very much as you see in this slide. It means a lot of freedom, people sitting around for hours, enjoying the open air, drinking tea or whatever they prefer endlessly, chatting with friends. This is just to give you an idea of the pre-modern times and years before that. So what provincialism means is also certain kind of spatial existence, which is characterized by crowding, by cheek by jowl kind of living, and what people usually consider is chaos. They call it chaos. I call it garbage, and it's there's a lot of continuity between the indoor and outdoor, a lot of presence of animals. Freedom is another term for it all. But again, just as I was saying about the weavers, this comes at the price of powerlessness. Provincial people do not have the potential of moving out of the provinces. It's not as if they have actively spurned the metropolises. They'd rather stay in a small town than go to Mumbai. They often claim that, but that claim is part of that same kind of relative lack of choice, which already predefines what they're going to be and what they're going to like. Here I want to just mention a scholar that I admire very much called Sanjay Srivastava, who's made the study of a very important public school in India. Public school in the British sense of being an elite private school. It's called the Doon School. It's up in the mountains, and Doon School is now, has this fantastic study by him called Constructing Post-Colonial India, in which he points out a very important, very, very fascinating point, that there is actually no such modern India or Indian until it is able to distance itself from mainstream India, from the masses of India. People, just like you see here, who are characterized by a certain backwardness. They live in a sloppy manner. They don't know what is speed, what is discipline, and how modernity should be lived and how it is characterized. They are characterized by ignorance and superstition and religiosity and various things like that. So with that, I'd like to make my point, which is that while he talks about that, and he's given me an insight which I respect and value a lot, I am really very interested in pursuing what these people think they are doing. And according to me, they have their own narratives, which are very powerful ones. They have their own schemes of living and thought and value, which are very important to consider. It's not that they are failing to do something and they are lapsing from some ideal that they should achieve. It's that they actually have other ideals and they actually have other models that they are living up to. And I am saying both things. I'm saying that these are very rich, very important to look at, while we must remember that at the total overall structural level, they are not going to guarantee them power. So, and that is not particularly their fault. That's a historical construct and a historical process that we have to look at beyond their lives. Another thing that characterizes is provincialism, and I am just bringing up Macaulay. I can never resist it. I'm sure no scholar of education of India can resist at least mentioning his name. He is like a shorthand for everything bad that ever happened to India. He looks like that, so I just want to use his portrait. He introduced a system. He didn't personally. I mean, he's one of the many. It was the whole state that did it. But in the middle of the 19th century was successfully introduced a system of education that exists to the present, that has not taken hold. That is the Indian modern system of education. And it's characterized by two faults, by two problems, by two gaping wounds, if I might be so dramatic. One of them is an actual absence of proper resources. And I would like to cite the case of Bombay University, which was founded in the 1850s. On the model of the University of London. So it's a very big, beautiful, well-endowed university which was full of fire and inspiration and all that. But even from its very beginnings, it had a shortage of, guess what? It had a shortage of laboratories, of scientific apparatus, and of professors who could use these things. So there, and if you look at the budgeting of the colonial state and all that, you'll see that right from the beginning, there was this drastic shortfall of resources. So that's one problem. And the other one is just the lack of political will, the lack of the development of a scheme of introducing this modern education, which was introduced into India. And for that, I'll just take the example of teaching of English. English, there was this mad, insane experiment of having millions of people suddenly be educated in English. And that might have worked, who knows, one of the ifs of history, had there also been some kind of a move to develop a technical system for doing that. But that was not done. It was just like, we will it, so it will happen. And that's the two things, the lack of resources and the poor resources, and the lack of real systems. So I, elsewhere, have written an A to Z, as I call it, of education in India, in which I'm only talking about this problem, this technological problem of not having systems in place. I'll just give you 2 or 3 quick examples, if I may, just the first 2 or 3 alphabets. So, for instance, English does not have, when I say it doesn't have an actual system for being taught in, people are not aware, for instance, that it's not a phonetic language, and there are ways of teaching English that elsewhere exist, and there is no debate on the subject, there's no development of these issues or anything. Most of the time it is taught either by rote, like children are actually learning up CAT, CAD, BAT, BAT, etc., without having any idea about what its implication is or how to use it for either work or pleasure, or it is taught in a translation method. And so you learn, A is for apple, and then you translate, apple means this, B is for this means this, etc. And it just goes on and on and on. You have a very, very huge problem in the absence of books. Indians love narratives, they love stories, but there is absolutely almost no reading available for children, and so the textbook becomes a crutch. It becomes something that you have to completely, continuously consume because it's the only kind of book that is available. You have such a bad aesthetics in the spaces of schools. There is no idea of making anything child-friendly or child-centered or even mildly comfortable, leave aside attractive. And finally is a very interesting question of discipline. There are 2 kinds of disciplines, just like there are 2 kinds of freedoms. So here you have an example of a Foucauldian kind of discipline, which is what characterizes modernity, where you have middle-class children, as you see here, who successfully over the years internalize, and practice self-discipline. They know how to do their homework, how to keep their copybooks, etc., and attend classes regularly and punctually. And then you have the other kind, in which you only have the superficial trappings of dress, uniform, belt, buckle, etc., and a lot of rules, but that does not percolate to a modern use of time or space or how to translate it into learning processes. Let me go on and just mention another narrative. So this technological problem of the absence of resources then brings me to another very interesting question as to what were the elite doing. And here you have the case of the first modernizer in India, Munroe. He was earlier than Macaulay, and even before Macaulay, he proposed that all Indians should be taught Western sciences, Western languages, literatures and all that, and should become modern people like Europeans, because he believed in the alchemy, which all Indian elite and reformers and leaders have since believed in. So that's very early on, 1772 is when he was born. But from then, there has been no new idea. It's the same idea that continues in education, which is that you have to have an Indian kind of upbringing at home. You learn Indian values and systems of thought at home, and you learn that of Europe and the West in school. And together you will become a perfect person, because the synthesis is exactly what you need. And it has actually worked. India has a class of middle-class people, educated people, who demonstrate, if you like, the best of the global citizen. They are actually quite comfortable in more than one world. They actually speak more than one language. They can hold in their heads more than one value system, and they use it, as is apparent now, for very practical, utilitarian, and profitable purposes. So I'm very interested in this whole approach, which I call plurality, and I link it to a search in history for concepts that don't necessarily exist today, but you have to develop them, find them somehow, make them up in order to understand the reality of pre-modern times or other kinds of reality, even in modern times. And so I think that this understanding of plurality is very important, that you can have more than one identity. You can actually live in more than one world because you function perfectly well in more than one language. You can have more than one mother. That's completely commonplace for Indians. And this this reality of the modern educated Indian coming down now for some 7 generations from Munroe is something that fascinates me, that I've written about in terms of studying like 100 members of the Indian intelligentsia and following them from their childhood onwards, etc. I wish there could be more research on this, and I think it would be something that would be true for all countries, post-colonial countries like India. It has a very important gender aspect, which is changing a little bit now as more and more women are playing other roles apart from just housewife, mother, and hostess in the house. And the gender aspect is that most of the learning at home was, of course, by not biological mothers necessarily, but surrogate mothers, people who were playing the role of mothers. And so this nice achievement of having a plural kind of subject emerge, who maintained a continuity with the indigenous, but who was also very cosmopolitan and westernized, this very nice thing that was achieved by the elite was done at the expense of women, because as long as they could play this role of being the teacher at home and being the socializer and so on, it worked very nicely. Now there are more strains appearing because fewer women are doing that, so good for them. Two members of the intelligentsia, Rabindranath Tagore and Gandhi, are very fascinating because they demonstrate through their own example how you could actually get out of this box. Now, this feat that was accomplished by the elite of bringing together two kinds of educational experiences in their own lives and becoming this plural person was not replicated by them for the masses. So the masses remained distanced from modern education and only living within their family, community, histories, and worlds. Whereas the elite managed to do both things. They managed to live in that world and in this world. But what I'm saying is they were not able to replicate it because they didn't understand how technically it worked. The two exceptions are Tagore, who started a university of his own, and Gandhi, who started a whole system in the school, in the country, a national schooling system. And the reason is very interesting. I really want to bring your attention to this. The reason for both of these people being so exceptional was that their own schooling had been extremely problematic. So they were able to think outside the box. Tagore actually never went to school successfully. He tried many schools, he had to give them all up, and he was finally only taught at home. And Gandhi, if you read his autobiography, had a horrendous time in school. He barely managed, and he never liked any of the education that he went into. So both of them realized that the fault lay not in the children, in the student, or anything like that, which is a mistake that almost everyone makes, but that it lay in the system, which was actually very bad, technically speaking, and was not conducive to learning for children. Plural education means bringing together studying in college like this, with taking myths and narratives and stories like this very seriously all at the same time. Now my final point, and with that I will end, is about activism. I find that that I understand the history of education well if I get involved in education in the present, which of course you might say all of us already do. But I think adults actually forget their own educational experience very well. They succeed in forgetting it, and they create a very nice distance between themselves as adults and children, and thereby lose their ability to empathize. So you want to empathize with your informant, you want to understand what's actually going on in the school, in the classroom. My submission is that you have to be involved in schooling. For India, I think it's extremely important because from what I've been trying to describe, it's the elite who are as complicit, the educated people who are as complicit in producing this absence of good education as are the as is anything else. And I just want to bring this thing to your attention. The last scholar I want to mention is Norman Weiner, whose thesis is that the problem with India having so much illiteracy and such a poor education system is that there is a kind of conspiracy of the elite which wants to preserve their privileged situation by denying the similar privileges to the majority of people. And I think that he's correct, except that this kind of thing is practiced by everyone, and the elite themselves don't have a very privileged kind of education. They have lots of shortcomings in their education, which I will not even start going into. But in order to overcome this problem, I have this whole approach which I call post-colonialism, which consists of precisely two things. One is to go beyond the twin problems of colonialism, to create actual resources, because I was saying that the resources don't exist, resources that are appropriate for India. So you have to be extremely imaginative and creative and come up with those resources which the colonial state never did and independent India never did. But the second thing would be to also forge a kind of mindset which is more than hierarchical, which consists of thinking that the problem lies not in them, some kind of a them and us-them approach, but in us, because our history is one. And to emphasize the technology, exactly how to do it, not the politics. The politics is extremely good in India. Everyone recognizes, that it's all about equality, democracy, and let's protest for that. But the nitty-gritty, substantial things of what should we actually have, for example, this is what I think should be worked on and pursued, and it's not done. Thank you.
We're going to shift our attention here to the United States, to the history of the U.S., particularly in the 20th century, a very different context than what we've been looking at in our discussion of India just now. Dan had asked us to situate our research in the context of historical studies of schooling more broadly. So what I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of my research, particularly the book Americans All that I recently published, which traces the rise and decline of multicultural education in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And to do that in order to then raise three broader questions that lie beneath that work, and questions that I think are of interest more generally to people looking at the history of schooling, especially, but not only in the United States. And questions, I think, of interest to people looking at American political and social history in the 20th century, even beyond the question of schools. So I want to then draw on my research to start to suggest some ways to think about those broader questions. I know many of the students here are working on your own research projects this semester in the Munroe Center seminar, so maybe some of these questions and ideas will resonate with your own projects, and we can find ways of talking together about how they play out in your own work. So just in brief, my book, Americans All, looks at something called the Cultural Gifts Movement. This was an educational campaign that encouraged Americans to appreciate cultural diversity. The movement began in the mid-1920s, it extended through the Second World War, and its goal was to encourage Americans to overcome their own racial and ethnic and religious prejudices. Its advocates celebrated the cultural contributions of immigrant and minority groups to American life. So this work was in some ways a precursor to what came later to be called multicultural education or ethnic studies, and elements of this earlier work have resonated over the years in more recent movements. The leaders of this movement were liberal thinkers and educators who brought their ideas primarily to schools, also to churches and to parent education groups around the country. I picked up the term cultural gifts from the materials that they wrote because they were celebrating the gifts that each group brought to American life. So these people were explicitly arguing against the melting pot theory that many of you are familiar with, I'm sure, and against forced Americanization, the idea that immigrants should just abandon their old world ways to become Americans. These cultural gifts advocates instead said that people should preserve their cultural traits, that immigrants could preserve it, they could be fully American and be ethnic at the same time, that the particular cultural values and traditions that people brought from their lands of origins could actually benefit American society, enrich American culture, or enrich American institutions and traditions. So that this could be a source of strength for the country. And that recognition of the gifts of immigrants and minority groups could actually foster a broader democratic participation, broader civic engagement. So these advocates sponsored educational programs in cities and towns across the country, and they saw themselves as creating a national project that would redefine American identity in the broadest sense. Now, many of you have probably never heard of this movement and are thinking to yourself, what? What's this all about? I actually had never heard of this either when I began my research. The 1920s is really known much more for its advocacy of tribalism. People call it the tribal 20s. It was a time of extreme anti-immigrant sentiment, a time of anti-black violence, a time, the Red Scare, immigration restriction, the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. So the 20s is known more for political disfranchisement and lynchings and forms of segregation. But my research found that there's actually a counter trend as well, in which some Americans were working against those more repressive trends to try to foster a more inclusive and sympathetic view of immigrants and minorities. I'm trying hard not to say the word tolerant because they disliked the word tolerant. They thought it wasn't broad enough and inclusive enough. They wanted to foster true sympathetic understanding and deep appreciation for cultural diversity. Now, in the book, I go on about why this movement emerged and where it came from. I won't tell you the details there, but part of the answer has to do with particular intellectual developments of the time period. Some of you are familiar with the anthropologist Franz Boas, who argued for cultural relativism, the idea that no one culture was superior to another. And that thinking very much influenced this movement. This was also a period that saw the rise of behaviorist psychology, which was the idea that young people were malleable, were formative, could be trained one way or the other. And this kind of psychological thinking, behaviorism, gave rise to the idea that young people could be trained away from prejudice, that prejudice was learned, and that young people could instead be taught appreciation and sympathy. And this was, by the way, a breakthrough at the time, because before the 1920s, psychologists had thought that prejudice was instinctive, that it was innate to people. But in the 1920s, thanks in part to behaviorism, thanks in part to Boasian anthropology, scientists and intellectuals came to argue that prejudice was actually learned. And so this was this insight of tremendous optimism, that if prejudice was learned, it could be unlearned, and appreciation could be learned instead. And so cultural commentators and teachers began to argue that they could undo prejudice within a generation. With great optimism, they were confident that they could do that. So that's part of the context of where this came from. I want to look just right now, particularly at what cultural gifts, how it happened in the schools, since we're talking here about the schools in particular, and because the schools were the heart of this work, and give you a few details about how this movement played out in American schools in the 1920s and 30s. Advocates very much believed that children were the key to fostering this new viewpoint for the reasons I just articulated, because children were malleable, they were still in their formative period. And the schools became a critical institution through which they hoped to promote these new ideas. Now, there was a key figure in this movement in the schools, a woman named Rachel Davis Du Bois, who I have spent a lot of time with in the last years and feel very close to. I mean that metaphorically. She's no longer alive. But I have read through all of her papers and all of her letters and all of her books, so I feel that I've gotten to know her well. She was a high school history teacher from New Jersey. She was a white Quaker. She had been a peace advocate. She was not a relation to W.E.B. Du Bois, the great black sociologist who some of you have heard about. But they became friends, and they liked to joke about that perhaps they shared ancestry in common, although she was a white Quaker and he was a black writer. So they had a close connection. Rachel Du Bois came to care deeply about cultural diversity and to argue that immigrants and minorities should maintain their ethnic ties. And so in 1924, she started putting on assembly programs at the high school where she taught that would teach the students at her school about the contributions of various groups. And over the next decade, she promoted this assembly format. And the way she set it up was by looking at culture groups one at a time. So there'd be an assembly program 1 month on Germans, and then another month on Japanese, and then the next month on English contributions or Jewish contributions, African American, Polish, Chinese. And you'll see that she intermingled their so-called dominant groups with more recent immigrant or minority groups, right? And at the assembly, she would invite community leaders to come speak about their cultural group, to talk about the culture, history of the group. Somebody would come and highlight the artistic or scientific economic achievements or talk about famous people from that group. There might, for instance, be a reading of poetry or a dance performance or a song. And Du Bois's idea was that she would invite what she called the most cultured representatives of each group, who would counter the stereotypes that students held and emphasize cultural traits that were particularly compatible with American traditions. So after students would attend this assembly program, they'd go back to their classrooms, they'd research that group. At the end of the month, they'd come put on their own assembly about what they had learned about that group, and then the next month, they'd move on to a new group. Now, initially, Du Bois was targeting children who were white and Protestant and native born. She thought that these children had a particular need to learn about the cultural contributions of immigrants and minorities, because these children, the white native-born Protestant children, would become the dominant members of society. But over time, she came to focus as well on the children of immigrant and minority groups, because there was increased attention in the 1930s to what was called the second-generation problem, the problem that children who have immigrant parents growing up in the United States felt alienation, felt distress, felt themselves removed from American civic life. And Du Bois thought that by teaching them about the cultural contributions of their own background, of their own community, she could make them feel cultural pride, ethnic identity, and bring them into the American community, bring them into American citizenry through learning about their own family and community traditions. Now, Du Bois started this program, this assembly program, at her high school in New Jersey. Then she went on to Teachers College at Columbia University to get a degree in educational sociology. She went on to found a clearinghouse on what she now called intercultural education. She organized guest speakers. She traveled around the country. She trained teachers. She gave workshops. She published books and articles. Over the years, she reached tens of thousands of teachers and students with this cultural gifts message by promoting this widely to schools. So Du Bois was really the leader of what became a larger phenomenon. So following her lead, other educators around the country began to experiment with similar kinds of programs. So kindergarten teachers, high school teachers, Sunday school instructors, parents, all attempted these experiments to try to teach interracial understanding and sympathetic approaches to other groups. And many of them published widely accounts of their work, trying to disseminate these ideas. And many other institutions joined this project. And there I have evidence from around the country of different kinds of experiments in the schools, in the burgeoning parent education movement, in Sunday schools, to teach all about this, this cultural gifts message. And in some ways, Du Bois and these advocates succeeded in their mission. And so let me just take a moment to acknowledge their real accomplishments. Because together, these cultural gifts advocates were able to pioneer what I consider a bold and progressive vision of an inclusive American identity. They were able to offer an alternative to forced Americanization that suggested to young people that ethno-racial identity could in fact be compatible with national identity, and that immigrants and minorities could maintain their own traditions while still embracing full citizenship. So in some ways, I think it's fair to say that their work promoted an expansive democracy that did in fact recognize the cultural diversity of the American people. There's a long story about what happened to this movement. It did fade away by the 1940s, and I'll just outline that in brief, since you can get the big picture of this here. What happened by the end of the 1930s is that the cultural gifts movement fell from favor because of the rise of Nazism in Europe and the onset of World War II. Americans began to fear the incursion of Nazism into the United States, and they began to move away from pluralism, from identifying ethno-racial identity. That now became to seem dangerous and divisive to focus too much on ethnic pride and national identity. At the same time, social scientists began to suggest new ways of understanding the origins of prejudice, and new theories emerged to explain prejudice. After World War II, activists looked for new ways to address, new strategies, new ways to address the consequences of ethno-racial diversity in the United States. And if you look at the ethnic movements of the 1960s and 70s, they embraced new tactics to demand not only cultural appreciation, but also social and political equality. So this brief sketch, this brief overview of the project brings me to 3 broader questions that I want to raise about the history of schooling that I hope will resonate with some of you and can lead to further discussion. As I said, I think these are questions that are particular to the U.S., but perhaps relevant to other contexts as well. So the first question that this project addresses, and many of your projects look at, is this one. How have Americans used the schools to craft a unified national identity from a diverse citizenry? This is really, for American historians, the big question about schools, and in some ways the big questions about the 20th century, because this has been the grand project of 20th century American liberalism. How do you define one national identity from a people from enormously diverse and varying backgrounds? So the schools in the United States have played a critical role in this project. They have been the central institution charged with this task, with socializing young people coming from all different kinds of backgrounds. They have been the meeting ground for children, and they have been seen as the chief vehicle of opportunity and equality. So schools have functioned really as the primary civic institution designed to promote a common citizenship and a democratic participation in a pluralist society. We see this play out in today's world. If you look at the debates over the teaching of American history and from the Texas Board of Education, if you look at what's happening in Arizona today, you see over and over this question of how exactly should the schools try to craft a citizenry from a diverse people. So that's a straightforward question, but the answer is really quite complicated. And the results of these efforts on the part of school people have not always been exactly what they imagined. So let me give you an example from my research that illuminates, I think, some of the issues at stake in that question. In my research, what I found is that the efforts of the cultural gifts activists, who you know I admire in many ways, as I've just said, their efforts were marked by very important oversights, and that these limitations help explain why this movement faded away, why it became lost to popular memory and historical scholarship, and why it did not, in fact, succeed in the long term in bringing about the goals that its advocates hoped for. So one of these limitations was the way in which cultural gifts, this assembly project that I've just described to you, the way that it perpetuated stereotypes of its own. So cultural gifts programs tended to be selective and sometimes superficial. They celebrated the particular traits of each group that advocates perceived to be socially valuable, but they ignored the ones that advocates didn't like so much, that they didn't think were in fact so compatible with American identity. So members of each group were expected to exhibit certain qualities and to voice allegiance to particular traditions, but to let fall other kinds of traditions or other kinds of characteristics. So this process reinforced ethno-racial categories and advanced, in the end, a pretty narrow understanding of race and ethnicity. If you think about those assembly programs I described, where each group was presented one by one, you can see that there was little room in this process for complex cultural identity, for change over time, for mixed ancestry, for multiple affiliations. So in the end, the cultural gifts movement ended up reinforcing a particular narrow notion of ethno-racial identity. And I think that points to broader questions at the heart of what it means to craft a unified national identity. How exactly can the schools do it? How have they done it? To what extent have they succeeded with the best intentions? And to what extent, despite those best intentions, have they fallen short of truly crafting an identity that recognizes the true complexity of American ethnic and racial life? This, for me, raises perhaps some ties to Nita's points about provincialism, because in the United States, of course, we have an enormously decentralized educational system. So anytime we talk about schools, we have to remember that school systems vary widely, not only regionally, but even from district to district. So this project of crafting some kind of national identity is even more complex when we take into account the tremendous variation among schools, even from one district to another in the same region. So a second question that I think is of interest to those of us looking at the history of schools is this: how have the schools shaped and reflected and addressed ideals of equality and patterns of inequality in the United States? These questions of equality and inequality loom large in our understanding of American history in the 20th century more generally. But I think it's fair to say that the link between education and social mobility is not so clear-cut. It's been fraught with debate. There have long been tensions between egalitarianism and excellence. We've seen conflicts over the impact of race and class and religious biases on school composition and curricula and funding. And some of the most critical developments in this country in the past century have been worked out in the realm of the schools. If you think of the Brown versus Education decision, for instance, the decision that ended legal segregation and initiated the modern civil rights movement, I think it's no accident that that decision took place in the realm of the schools, because again, the schools have been that central socializing institution, and the schools have represented this focal point for a lively debate over the promise of equality, over what it means to be American. So in my work, I found an important limitation in how the schools address socioeconomic inequality that I think can illuminate this question. So the cultural gifts approach, while it did a good job of eliminating cultural contributions, it overlooked social and economic factors that were equally critical to ethno-racial identity. And there are some important reasons for this, but what happened in the end is that the cultural emphasis that cultural gifts advocates promoted was quite effective in countering attitudes of prejudice towards European immigrants who faced relatively few structural barriers to full citizenship. But cultural gifts was actually incapable of eradicating discrimination against other minorities, and it was particularly inadequate to addressing the legal and political and economic inequalities that African Americans suffered in this country. Because of its focus on cultural contributions, cultural gifts largely ignored the bitter realities of segregation, of disfranchisement, of unequal material conditions, of anti-Black violence, and its proponents could even they ignored the bitter realities of segregation, and in fact its proponents sometimes managed to promote cultural understanding without challenging the legal systems that kept segregation in place. So cultural gifts advocates did not publicly challenge the system that sent white and Black children to separate schools, even as they were trying to teach about cultural understanding. So this, I think, shows us that even a movement dedicated to cultural understanding could fail to acknowledge the very real economic realities that shaped race relations in the United States. I should say, as an aside, that African American thinkers did enter this conversation and did in fact encourage cultural gifts advocates to look more seriously at economic inequalities. So the movement began in the 1930s to shift. But this, again, raises the point that when we look at schools and inequality in the United States, the story is often complicated. The intentions of school leaders are often not exactly in line with the results of the programs that they intend to implement. And the link between schools and attempts to confront inequality are often quite fraught and complicated. So a third question is this one. How have ideas about schools filtered down to the classroom level? Or another way I would phrase this is, how have teachers and students themselves shaped schools? And how do we uncover their voices? It's much easier, of course, and those of you who have begun your research have, I'm sure, found this out, it's much easier to discover the thoughts and activities of school administrators, of school board officials, of journalists, of educational leaders who wrote curricular guides. It's much harder to find the voices of teachers and particularly of students. Students are young people, they're often children, they're sometimes pre-literate, they're marginalized because of age, because of status, yet their perspectives are critical to our understanding of the school because they have shaped what actually happens in the classroom. But yet they've left so few records. And this is a topic of great frustration to many of us who look at the history of schools. How do you actually find out what children in the schools were doing and thinking? So when we do find their stories, we see that what actually happened in the classroom was not always what school leaders had intended. So I can just give you a couple of quick examples from my research here as to what teachers were doing and what students were doing. So in my work, I spent a lot of time in the archives. I came across evaluation forms that teachers had written for in-service courses that Rachel Du Bois gave. She traveled around, she gave courses to teachers, trying to introduce them to minority and cultural groups so that they would have greater compassion and understanding. She hoped that they would go back and bring that into the schools. Well, when I actually looked at those evaluation forms, I found that some teachers did in fact come away with new attitudes, but some didn't. Some came away with which showed the persistence of their old attitudes. And they probably returned to their classrooms with their ideas very much intact. Here's one teacher who wrote, after a lesson on the Jews, before taking this course, I could not understand why he, the Jew, was so aggressive. After hearing the history of the Jew, I understand the reason. So the Jew is still, in fact, so aggressive. Another right, the Jews are on the defensive, even some of their leaders. They resent us, even though they do not care to assimilate with us. After a lesson on Asian immigrants, one teacher wrote, the speaker clarified some of my personal experiences and dislikes for the Oriental. So clarified some of the dislikes. Another wrote, I can't thoroughly accept the idea of complete integration among peoples whose philosophy and religion is totally different, but I certainly have greater understanding for them. Well, this is not what Rachel Du Bois hoped to advocate, right? She wanted them to have greater appreciation. She wanted them to see the Jews not as particularly aggressive. She wanted them to understand their attitudes and to understand that Jews did in fact want to assimilate, and maybe assimilate's the wrong word, didn't want to fully incorporate themselves into the larger American life. I also came across some examples of what students wrote. I did some research in the archives of the Commission on Interracial Cooperation, which was an organization in the South that tried to teach white students to appreciate their black neighbors. And they promoted black cultural contributions by sending pamphlets around the South, and they sponsored essay contests about black cultural contributions, and luckily they saved some of those essays in the archives. One student wrote, for instance, let me see if I can give you a quick example here. Brotherhood does not mean social equality. What should be our attitude? Assimilate them? No, they are different. In the name of humanity, let them stay so. Another wrote, intermarriage or mingling between the races should be absolutely prohibited. Whites have many principles of civilization which would be lost or lowered by such intercourse. We white people can do the Negroes more good by teaching them the fine points of our civilization while keeping our own intact. So this is just an example from a student essay that makes the point that the best intentions of the teachers did not, in fact, translate necessarily into changed attitudes on the parts of students. And I find that a very important reminder that when we're looking at schools, we need to take into account, to the fullest extent we can, it's often tricky, to the fullest extent we can, that the voices of teachers and students, when we can find them, are critical to our understanding of what happened in the classroom. You can see there from that one example that the students did not carry away the attitudes that people hoped. Now, just in conclusion, I feel obliged to address the question that Dan charged us with. How does all of this contribute to our understanding of educational debates today? Those of us who care about schools today, why should we know this history? If you want to be teachers, if you want to go into educational reform, why should we know this history? I have been mulling this over, and I confess that I do not have a simple answer to this question, and maybe some of you do. I don't know how much I have to offer on this. I think that understanding the histories of schools does not give us a magical solution to the problems of the present day. At its best, perhaps it can remind us of some pitfalls. It can warn us of some problems to avoid. It can remind us that the best intentions do not always translate into the kinds of results we want to see. And it can remind us that very well-intentioned, educated, energetic, dedicated people in the past have turned their attention to the schools and have done their best to try to make reforms that they think would improve American schools and improve American life more broadly. So looking at the history of schools, I hope can help us situate ourselves in that long line of people who have come before us, even though it does not necessarily give us answers for today. Thank you.
I want to thank both panelists for just terrific presentations. I'm going to say very briefly a couple of things. When one puts together a panel, which is not terribly common in the discipline of history, when one puts together a panel across such geographic dispersed areas, one hopes for kind of unexpected and unplanned connections and frictions, and that they will be suggested. To me, I heard in both presentations reminders that schooling is really central to the history of both of these societies, not a peripheral or area of specialization, but central to the history of these societies in the last 100 to 150, 200 years. And yet if we stop and look at the mainstream survey courses that are taught about these societies, the mainstream historical surveys, it's a good bet that most of the time those surveys won't say very much about schooling. So I think one of the things here is we have a part of society, schooling, that is central to mass societies over the past 2 centuries, and yet historians haven't treated it as central. They've treated it as a kind of secondary area of specialization that you might get to if you're really interested in, but you don't teach it the way you teach political and economic history as central. And I think that that's interesting that we ourselves are educators, but have treated our predecessors in education as more peripheral to the history of these societies than they really are. I think some reasons of that have to do with institutional, putting the study of education in ed schools and ed programs, and that's, I think, distanced it from work in mainstream history, which is unfortunate. But I also think it's part of a participation in a kind of lack of self-awareness about the mixed role education has played in society. If we made it central to our historical studies, we'd have to own up more to the kinds of reports we're getting in both of these papers, that creating an educated group in India is creating a group that defines itself in relationship to others that are made provincial, that cultural gift movements are partially successful but partially reinforce stereotypes. And what we would learn if we treated schooling as central as I think we should to the histories of these states is not completely flattering about our activity as educators. And I think that may be part of the a motivation of a kind of avoidance in keeping it as a secondary topic rather than a central topic in the histories of these societies in the past 200 years. There's other very interesting connections in both of these presentations about how central schooling has been to the production of identities that I think we can think about. But I'm going to stop because I get lots of time to talk over the course of the semester in this series. And we're tight on time, but I'd like to take about 10 or 15 minutes for formal questions and comments. And then I know that since both panelists are in town, there'll be opportunities for people to follow up and continue the conversation in dispersed and diffused ways informally. So we'll take our first question. Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you for both of you, your excellent presentations. A lot of the stuff on the Indian culture and history, I didn't know about that. Most of the stuff that you presented, I did know, but it was still excellent nonetheless. Great information to have. The question I had was for the second young lady. What was the issue you had, the question you had about, I don't know how we get it in the, what was the question? I kind of missed it.
I'm sorry, which question are you interested in? I posed a few questions.
At the end of your presentation, you said something about understanding or by getting it in the curriculum. My mind was kind of...
The final question was when Dan asked us about how is this material relevant to people interested in education today? Why do we need to know the history of schools? Yeah.
Stu.
Yeah, Dan, I want to ask you a question, and forgive me if we've talked about this over some time, and I may have asked you this before, but the cultural gifts people, when they talk about the contributions, the contribution of this group or the contribution of that group, it always reminds me of the simultaneous moves in the sort of political public intellectual sphere by Horace Callan and by Louis Brandeis. I'm thinking of True Americanism and some of the other essays, which were directly in reaction to the 100% Americanizers melting pot stuff. And on the one hand, Callan and Brandeis talk about the unique cultural characteristics of groups that need to be preserved, that you can have an American nationalism and underneath it the flourishing of 1,000 cultural identities. But it's always seemed to me that with Brandeis in particular, that's enfolded within a larger kind of American commonality that's fundamentally defined by political institutions. That is, it's fine to have cultural pluralism, but everybody's got to believe in the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the two-party system and all of the rest of it. There's kind of a plane on which that operates as a unifying mechanism. It's almost entirely political. or economic to some degree. You're allowed to have cultural pluralism, but you're not allowed to be, you know, a socialist or, right?
Yes, exactly.
So I guess I'm wondering about the connection between that kind of thinking. Were Brandeis and Callan and the people we usually call pluralists, were they supporters of this? Or they
Yeah.
know what was going on?
They were influences, certainly. So many of the cultural gifts advocates, many of these leaders of these institutions and these school programs drew on the thinking of Callan, of Randolph Bourne, for instance, and saw them as intellectual influences on their work, certainly. And I think it's fair to say that they followed along those lines in assuming a bottom line of a particular political view or political allegiance underlying their notion of culture. I think that's true. What was different about this than about those intellectuals is that they were trying to bring it to beyond elite intellectuals into this very broad American life, into every school, they hoped, and every home. So this would no longer be simply the purview of the elite intellectuals, but would spread more widely. But yes, I think that is fair to say that their ultimate hope was that Americans would all buy into the political ideals. Yeah.
Question of minor later.
Hi, I have a question for Nita. What would you say are the obstacles to developing countries, and especially in India, to the provision of quality education, particularly initiated by the government?
What were the obstacles to quality education? I think I would say that's the point I was trying to make in a nutshell, is that there are two kinds of main obstacles. One is that there are very poor resources developed. And I don't mean that you have to have fancy buildings and fancy furniture. It can be very inexpensive and totally suitable to the conditions of that country, the environmental conditions. And that was the case in indigenous education before the introduction of this new system of schooling, which was very suitable to the countries that it came from, but it did not particularly work in India. Even today there are crumbling buildings and defaced walls and so on, because those are not the ways that Indians like to live. So there has to be a development of resources that are appropriate and that can actually be done. I mean, so far it all exists on paper, that this is the size you should have for a classroom, these are the spaces you should have as playgrounds, this is the library, this is the laboratory. But actually no school has them, not a single public school in India. And there's over 1 million, has this kind of set of resources. And then the second problem is this colonial mindset which continues, and for which I have suggested, a post-colonial kind of approach. Colonial mindset means that there is still, it's twofold. There's still the thinking that we are okay for the elite, and they are the problems, so it's this still the same mindset as the British had when they ruled India, and it prevents any real action from being taken, because from this top-down approach you're not going to ever be able to speak the right language or take the right steps. It just doesn't work. But the second point is also this idea of looking over your shoulder at some other authority who's going to provide the solution. So instead of the teacher actually being seen as the primary agent in her classroom, and the school as being autonomous, trying to run its own thing, it's always government this and these people that. It's again a colonial mindset where the state had monopolized on power and they did not let others do things effectively. So this kind of psychological colonization, or whatever we want to call it, internal colonization continues, and I think that's the real problem. And for that you need a whole lot of training. I actually advocate training in theatre. That's what I do in India when I go there. I train people in theatre games, teachers, administrators, and all that. It's one way to get out of the cycle that you're already brought up in, because if you've gone through that kind of a childhood and socialization and schooling yourself, it's not really easy as an adult to get out of that mindset.
Matthew.
Really interested in both talks, and more explicitly the first lecture on India, about your idea of freedom and negative versus positive freedoms. And I would say that you identify a lot of negative, or a freedom that deals with negatives more often, which is that it is the freedom not to have to be in a classroom all day long, or the freedom not to have to dress a certain Western way, versus the freedom to be able to cross from class to class, or the freedom to determine one's own form of employment. And I was wondering how these two versions of freedom are viewed in a society that has a different value system than my own.
I'm not sure if the value systems are so different. I think that there's a lot of there are lots of sites of schooling in this country that I'm aware of, inner city schools and all that, where exactly that kind of freedom is being expressed by children, which I find in the street children in India. They want to be free of control and discipline. They don't want to listen to teachers. They want to just express whatever they want randomly, rather than follow quote-unquote rules, which seem to be from the outside, imposed on them from the outside. And that's pretty much the approach in India. These children want to be free. That's why they are either dropouts, because in India there's not that much strictness in making children have to go to school, even if there is on paper mandatory schooling. And when they are not in school, they really don't have that much of an agenda or anything. So it is very negative, I think. And I think that the other common theme that I see, the common thing which I see in both societies, Indian and American, is that actually the positive statements are very weak in both cases. I think progressivism, if I may call it that, in this country has not worked out, and it's full of problems, and it's one expression of a set of things that should be done, but it has not been replaced by more concrete ideas about it. And in India, those ideas are actually lacking, including among the people. So I'm saying the children who are practicing freedom don't actually have a very positive idea of what they want to do. They just want to not do certain things.
Before we take one or maybe two last questions, I just want to follow up on that. You talked about the similarity between the children who are looking for freedom from being in the classroom. You suggested some inner city schools here. What I was struck by was how similar your description was at that moment to the description of the pursuit of being outside of the rules and being free in one of the great ethnographic studies of education, which is Willis's Learning to Labor. And what he calls the group that are known as the lads in that ethnography, and all the creative ways they get themselves out of being in the classroom on time or being in the right classroom, and their pursuit of that kind of freedom is remarkably convergent and is a good example of it being in a second place. And a wonderful, one of probably our best school ethnographies that people haven't read. I strongly recommend it. Go ahead.
Then how successful were the cultural gifts advocates in getting their message out to a broader public? It seems to me what we think about the 20s is a kind of atmosphere of intolerance, that it may be that somehow that message was more underground and you started to counter narrative. I'm just wondering how submerged was that?
Right. Well, it depends how we measure it, of course. The message was widely disseminated. So, for instance, Parents Magazine, which is still around today, got its start in the 1920s. And was really the representative of the burgeoning parent education movement. The editor of the magazine was a great proponent of cultural gifts and published regular articles to parents with titles like Teach Your Children Tolerance and How to Raise Your Children Free from Prejudice. And that magazine reached a wide readership. I don't remember the numbers exactly, but the readership boomed in the 1920s and 30s, even during the Depression, and reached many, many middle-class parents around the country. The National Conference of Christians and Jews had these tours where these rabbis, priests, and ministers, I know that sounds like the beginning of a bad joke, but rabbis, priests, and ministers would travel around together and have a panel, and they would draw thousands of people to their tours talking about religious diversity. So they succeeded certainly in reaching a broad audience with their message. And even in the South, the Commission on Interracial Cooperation sent tens of thousands of pamphlets to schools detailing the contributions of blacks to American life. So if you look at the numbers, if you look at the message, it was widely disseminated. It became sort of stylish in a way to advocate diversity. It became stylish, up-to-date, modern, to argue against prejudice. You were a modern parent, you were a modern teacher if you knew this language and you could talk against prejudice. So in that sense, it was quite successful. Did it actually end prejudice and discrimination in this country? No, it didn't. Well, the problem is we don't have longitudinal studies to be able to trace those school children who experience these programs to see what happened in the future years. It's conceivable, though, to say that some of those children went on to become adults during the modern civil rights movement and perhaps gave support to the civil rights movement, perhaps influenced by some of the ideas they had received as children. So yes, so my point about the 1920s is that there's more than one story at play. I don't at all mean to diminish the racism and the violence of that time period, which was in fact quite profound, but at the same time to argue that there was another movement, another trend that did in fact include hundreds of thousands of Americans, at least on a certain level, even if it did transform American life. But yes, that's the question I've been wondering about for years. You know, what really happened? And it's very hard to say. And those of you working on questions of schooling will confront this as well. There are so many cultural, social forces at work. It's often hard to tear them apart, to try to trace what influences what and how you can look at the different kinds of causation and looking at cultural and social trends.
We've been going for about an hour and a half, so I'm going to ask that we thank our panelists.